She laughed when she said it. That's the part I can't get out of my head, not the words, the laugh. Dad, we signed the papers this morning. The cabin and the land, it's done. The new owners take possession in 30 days. I thought you should know. Then she hung up. I stood in my kitchen in Sudbury holding the phone against my chest, looking out at the snow coming down on the backyard. 43 years I'd lived in that house. The kettle was boiling. I turned it off. I sat down at the table and I didn't move for a long time. I want to be honest about something before I tell you the rest of this story. I am not a perfect man. I was not always a perfect father. I worked long hours when my kids were small. I missed school plays. I missed hockey games. I know that. I've carried it. But I also built something with my own hands. Literally, with these hands. And I did it so my family would have something solid to stand on when I was gone. That's what fathers do. Or at least, that's what I believed. The cabin had been in the family since 1987. I found the land myself, 212 acres north of Parry Sound, right on the edge of the Canadian Shield. Rock and spruce and a creek that never quite froze solid, even in February. I borrowed money from my brother-in-law to put down the deposit. Paid him back in 18 months. My wife Sandra and I used to drive up there every Thanksgiving, every Canada Day, sometimes just a random Friday in October when we needed to breathe. We brought the kids from the time they were babies. My son Garrett learned to cast a fishing line on that property. My daughter Noelle had her 16th birthday there, a bonfire and her friends from school, and Sandra's chocolate cake that somehow survived the 2.5-hour drive in the back of the Jeep. Sandra died 6 years ago, ovarian cancer. She was 61. After she passed, the cabin became the place I went when the grief got too heavy for the house. I'd drive up alone, split firewood I didn't need, walk the trail along the creek until my legs ached, sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch the light change over the rock face. I wasn't okay, but I was less not okay up there than anywhere else. I should tell you about my daughter-in-law, Renata. That's where this really begins. Garrett met her at a conference in Toronto. She worked in commercial real estate. Sharp, well-dressed, the kind of person who remembers exactly what you ordered at a restaurant 3 years ago and brings it up to make you feel seen. I liked her at first. Most people did. She was good at that. They got married 4 years ago. Small wedding up in Muskoka, very tasteful. I paid for half of it without being asked, because that's what I do. I don't say that to sound generous. I say it because later, when I looked back, I started to understand the pattern. 8 months after the wedding, Garrett called me to say they wanted to build a house. They'd found the lot in Barrie, good location, close to Renata's mother. Could I help with the down payment? I gave them $70,000. I told myself it was an early inheritance. I wrote a check and handed it to my son at a Tim Hortons on a Tuesday morning, and he hugged me and said, "You're the best, Dad." 14 months after that, Renata called, not Garrett, Renata, to say they were having cash flow issues with the renovation. Contractors going over budget. Could I help bridge the gap? Another $22,000. I transferred it the same day. Then there was the business loan. Renata wanted to launch her own brokerage. She needed a cosigner on a line of credit. I co-signed. $240,000. I remember sitting across from the bank manager at the TD branch in downtown Sudbury and thinking, this is what family does. What I didn't know was that Renata had already started looking at my land. I found out later, much later, that she had pulled the property records on the Parry Sound acreage about 2 years before any of this came to a head. She knew what it was worth. The market up there had shifted. A developer out of Vaughan had been buying up Shield Country parcels for a resort project, paying well above assessed value. My 212 acres, the creek, the old cabin I'd built with my brother over 3 summers, appraised at $1.1 million. Renata had done the math before I had any idea there was math to be done. It started with a conversation that seemed completely reasonable at the time. We were at Garrett and Renata's place for Easter, and after dinner Renata poured wine and said very casually that she'd been thinking about estate planning. She said it in the tone of someone doing me a favor. She said that properties like mine, held in my name alone, could create probate complications when I was gone. Had I thought about transferring it to a family trust, or possibly into Garrett's name, just to simplify things? I said I'd think about it. A month later, Garrett called and said the same thing, almost word for word. I noticed that. I didn't say anything, but I noticed. Then there was a Sunday visit where Renata showed up with a folder of documents she'd prepared. She said her lawyer had drawn them up. She was very calm, very professional, explaining each page. It was a transfer of title, the cabin and the land into Garrett's name. She said it was a gift, that there would be tax implications, but she'd looked into the lifetime capital gains exemption. It would be manageable. She had a pen ready. I didn't sign. I said I wanted to have my own lawyer look it over first. Renata smiled and said, of course, absolutely, take your time. But I saw something move behind her eyes, something that wasn't patience. That was in March. By June, the visits had stopped. Garrett stopped calling on Sundays. When I called him, he was always in the middle of something. Short conversations. I told myself it was work, the new brokerage, the stress of everything. I told myself a lot of things. In August, my daughter Noelle called me from Calgary, where she lives with her husband and their 2 boys. She said, "Dad, has something happened between you and Garrett? He called me last week saying you'd been difficult about the property, that you were being unreasonable." I sat down. Difficult how? He said you'd promised to transfer it to him and then backed out, that you'd been stringing them along. I had never promised anything. I told Noelle that. She believed me. She knows her brother. She knows Renata. But I could hear the worry in her voice. She said, "Dad, just be careful. Renata has been talking to people. I don't know what she's planning, but something feels off." I called my lawyer the next morning, a woman named Frances who'd handled Sandra's estate and who I trusted completely. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Graham, I want you to do something for me. Go up to the cabin this weekend and take photos of everything. Every room, the outbuildings, the trail markers, the creek, and bring me any original documents you have. The deed, the survey, the original purchase agreement." I did exactly that. I drove up on a Friday after lunch. The leaves were just starting to turn, that first blush of orange at the edges of the maples. I walked every inch of that property. I took 347 photos. I sat on the porch where Sandra and I used to sit, and I felt the specific weight of someone who suspects they're about to lose something irreplaceable. I also found the survey stake had been moved. Not dramatically, maybe 18 inches, but I knew that land the way you know your own face. I'd walked that northwest boundary 100 times. I photographed it from every angle, and I called Frances on the drive home. She said, "That's significant. Don't touch it. I'm going to make some calls Monday morning." What Frances found out over the next 3 weeks changed everything I thought I understood about what was happening. Renata had not been waiting for me to sign voluntarily. She had filed documents with the Land Registry Office in Parry Sound, documents that included what appeared to be my signature on a transfer of title dated 7 months earlier, a notary stamp, a witness signature I didn't recognize. She had forged it. Frances was very calm when she told me this. I was not calm. I was sitting at my kitchen table and my hands were shaking, and I had to put the phone down for a moment and look at the kettle on the stove and just breathe. The good news, Francis said when I picked back up, is that they haven't completed the sale. The developer's lawyers flagged an issue in the survey, the boundary discrepancy you found, and they put a hold on the closing. That's why the moved stake matters, Graham. Someone was trying to alter the registered boundaries to match a fraudulent survey. My son, I said. Does my son know about this? A pause. I think you need to ask him that yourself. I called Garrett that night. He didn't answer. I called 3 more times over the next 2 days. Nothing. Then I drove to Barrie. I parked in front of their house at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, and I rang the bell. Renata answered. She was in her work clothes, clearly about to leave. She looked at me, and I saw it clearly this time. Not the smooth, professional composure she usually showed me. Something colder. Graham, she said, this isn't a good time. I know what you did, I said. I kept my voice level. I had practiced this in the car for 2.5 hours. I have a lawyer. The land registry has been notified. The developer's closing is on hold. This is your one opportunity to talk to me before it becomes something else. She tried to close the door. I put my hand on the frame, not aggressively, just firmly, and I said, "Is my son home?" Garrett came down the stairs behind her. He was in his housecoat. He looked at me and he looked at Renata, and I watched the calculation happen in his face. "Dad," he said, "we can explain." "Don't," I said quietly. "Don't do that." We stood there in the doorway for a long moment. The neighbor across the street was walking her dog. A normal Tuesday morning in Barrie, and I was looking at my son's face and trying to find the boy who learned to fish on my land, trying to find something to hold on to, and I couldn't find it. I drove back to Sudbury. Frances moved quickly. She had already been in contact with the Ontario Provincial Police Financial Crimes Unit before I had made the trip to Barrie. The forged notary stamp turned out to be traceable. The notary in question had died 14 months earlier, and his stamp had been reported stolen from his estate. That detail cracked it open. It took 4 months. I want to be honest about that. It was not fast, and it was not clean. There were weeks when I didn't hear anything, weeks when Frances would call with updates that sounded like progress and then stall. I couldn't talk to Garrett. Noelle flew in from Calgary for a week in October, and we sat at my kitchen table, and she held my hand and didn't say anything particularly useful, but it helped anyway. I kept going up to the cabin on weekends. I kept splitting firewood. I kept walking the creek. The OPP charged Renata with fraud over $5,000, forgery, and uttering a forged document. The developer's company, once they understood what had happened, filed a civil complaint as well. They'd been close to completing a transaction on fraudulent title, and they were not pleased. Garrett was charged as a party to the offense. His lawyer argued limited involvement, that he hadn't known the full extent of what Renata had done. The Crown disagreed. I was called to give a statement. I drove down to Barrie on a gray November morning, and I sat in a room with a police officer, and Frances and I answered every question they asked me. When they were done, I walked out into the parking lot, and I sat in my truck for about 20 minutes before I could drive. The civil process to have the fraudulent title transfer nullified took another 2 months after that, but it was nullified. The deed came back into my name. Frances called me on a Thursday afternoon in January and said, "Graham, it's done. You own your land." I said thank you, and I hung up, and I stood in my kitchen and I cried. The first time I cried since Sandra's funeral, actually. Just stood there at the counter and let it happen. I sold the co-signed business loan position to a collections firm for 30 cents on the dollar and recovered what I could, the $70,000 from the down payment and the $22,000 for the renovation. That money is gone. I've made peace with that. I've had to. You can spend the rest of your life doing the accounting on what family has cost you, or you can decide what the rest of your life is actually for. Garrett and Renata separated while the legal process was ongoing. He called me in February, 8 months after I'd stood in his doorway. He didn't apologize exactly. He said things had gotten out of hand. He said Renata had convinced him it was the right thing to do. He said he was sorry I got hurt. I listened. I said I needed more time. I hung up. Maybe someday there's a conversation to be had. I genuinely don't know. What I do know is that I drove up to Parry Sound the first weekend in May when the ice on the creek had finally broken and the trilliums were coming up along the South Trail, and I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and I watched the light move across the rock face, and I thought about Sandra. And I thought about the 3 summers my brother and I spent building that cabin with wood we milled ourselves, and I thought about Noel's 16th birthday bonfire, and I thought about how close I came to losing all of it, not just the land, but everything the land meant. I didn't lose it. That's the part I want you to remember. Not the fraud, not the courtroom, not my son's face in the doorway. The part where it came back, the part where I was still standing. The trilliums were up, the creek was running. I finished my coffee and I went inside and I made lunch, and it was enough. I keep thinking about that Sunday afternoon when Renata laid the folder on my kitchen table, pen already uncapped, smile already in place. At the time I thought I was being cautious. Looking back, I think I was being taught something. Slowly, the way the hard lessons always come. What I understand now is that the whole thing only worked because I had spent decades being the kind of man who said yes. Not out of weakness, exactly. Out of love, or what I believed love required. I gave the down payment. I co-signed the loan. I drove to Tim Hortons on a Tuesday morning and handed my son $70,000 and told myself that's what fathers do. And it is, sometimes, but there's a line between generosity and abandoning your own judgment, and I had crossed it so gradually I didn't feel it happen. The fraud didn't come out of nowhere. It grew in the space I left open by not asking harder questions, by not noticing that Garrett's calls started coming less often after I didn't sign, by telling myself that uncomfortable things were probably just stress, probably just life. I'm not saying I deserve what happened. I don't believe that. But I do believe that when we stop paying attention to what's actually in front of us, we make room for people to fill that space with their own agenda. Frances, my lawyer, asked me once during those 4 months whether I was doing okay. I said I was managing. She said, "Graham, managing and okay are 2 different things." She was right. But she also showed me something I hadn't expected from that whole ordeal, that clear thinking, even when you're scared, even when it's your own son's name on the documents, is not a betrayal of love. It's the most honest thing you can do. I had to learn to hold both things at once, the grief of what Garrett had done and the clarity of what needed to happen next. Walking the trail along the creek that first weekend in May, after it was all finally over, I thought about the kind of person I want to be for whatever time I have left. Not harder exactly. I don't think hardness is the answer, but more awake, more willing to trust what I actually see rather than what I want to see. There's something in that, I think, for all of us. The willingness to act rightly even when it costs you, to do the thing that's honest even when the easier path is to let it go, to not make waves, to keep the peace at the expense of the truth, and then to keep going anyway. To drive back up to Parry Sound and split the firewood and make the coffee and sit on the porch and decide that the rest of your life still belongs to you. The trilliums don't know what happened that year. They came up anyway. I think that's the whole lesson, really. You come up anyway.